infrastructure in order to be able to produce food and fiber for our country. Look back, the legislation, the original legislation was adopted in around 1980, and the main concept at that time was a legal concept called coming to the nuisance. In other words, if a person comes and establishes a home, for example, near the potential nuisance, then they should not be in a position to sue for that nuisance as long as the operation is operating without negligence and legally. And that's a well understood concept. It's been in law for centuries. And this was an attempt to codify that in Georgia law. Well, Georgia and the rest of the country has changed a lot since 1980. If you think back then, there certainly were rural areas where there's not likely other types of residential or other people living. But now, if you look at Georgia, is there a place in the entire state, even in our rural areas, where there's not already this potential conflict between people who have moved to the country to live because they like being the country lifestyle, the rural lifestyle, and those who are there trying to make a living off their land. Just give you one example, and really the most fundamental part of the existing law that we think creates vulnerabilities for farming and agricultural operations, and that is in order for a farmer to present the defense of a right to farm if they are sued, there has to be what's called in Georgia law a changed condition. And a changed condition could be new people moving into the area, new homes, change in the magnitude of development or urban sprawl into an agricultural area. But the most important point is, in order for a farmer to have that right to farm defense available to them, there must be a changed condition. So there are many scenarios where it's very debatable whether or not a changed condition might exist. I'll give you an example. Let's say I'm a farmer.
Subdivision.
Colleagues here on the panel live in a subdivision that pre-existed the investment in the farm infrastructure. So I could coexist with my neighbors for decades, and then over time, as people move into the houses that are in that pre-existing subdivision, people who chose to come to an agricultural area, those people could bring suit, potentially, theoretically could bring suit, and the judge could determine, and most likely would determine, that there is no changed condition because the houses were there already. And that has happened in other states. Similar, different facts of the case, but similar situation in North Carolina, which really $100 million verdicts in North Carolina, which really caused us and people in Georgia and other parts of the country to evaluate their existing right to farm law to see whether or not there could be improvements. I'll point out one other. So that's the fundamental issue is in order to obtain or have right to farm protection available to you, you have to depend on an external situation, and that is there has to be a changed condition. I'll just close with one more point and pass it on to our friends up here. This council is focused on rural issues, and in the urban areas there are also elements to this that I think are very important, and we need to do a better job of explaining this to our urban friends. But urban agriculture, potential future growth for urban agriculture, it's already happening, but we know there's a great deal of potential there, and it's already very important in Georgia agriculture. But if you think about a establishing a new operation in an urban area, or for that matter, anywhere in Georgia now, with the development patterns we've had, there is, especially in an urban area, it's very unlikely that a new operation in an urban area could ever achieve right to farm protection, because it's unlikely that you're going to have change condition. In other words, the development and urban sprawl and the magnitude of non-farming operations or presence of residences is already there. So in the urban areas, you're likely never, a new operation invest perhaps millions would likely never get this protection. So very important to rural economies, but also important in urban areas as well. So I'll close there, and we'll just pass over to you.
Close in front there, so everybody can hear you that's watching.
All right, thank you, Mike, for that explanation. And Chairman, members of the committee, thank y'all for letting us be here. I'm Will Bentley with the Georgia Agribusiness Council, and won't go into a lot of other details just because Mike did such a good job of explaining kind of the base problem that we have. But I do want to reiterate that there's no bigger issue to our organization. I think several other organizations here, other priorities than right to farm. We think it's that important to our industry, that important to future investment in our industry, and something that we simply just have to strengthen and pass this session because it's becoming more and more of an issue around the state. Mike mentioned a little bit about the urban issues. That's not just your community gardens and other things that you see there. That's certainly issues that are happening. We're hearing complaints from people that have even been recruited to put in urban gardens and things in more metro areas. And then as they get there and they start farming those plots and everything, they start having neighbors that are complaining that their people are coming in and out at all hours of the night. Loud noises, sounds, things that go along with farming that they didn't know were going to happen in their neighborhood, and now they are. So we're seeing those complaints. And like Mike said, there's just no areas of the state where you can put agriculture where there's not already people there. There's no parts of the state that there's not generally people in that area, even on some of the largest tracts in South Georgia and North Georgia. There's people there. So we want to reiterate that. And we also we've seen a lot of investment in vertical farming, and we've had new members that have gotten into whether it's growing in containers or just vertical growth in more metro areas. And we certainly want those folks to be able to go to protect that investment because they're looking at millions and millions of dollars in either greenhouse space or container space or whatever it may be. They're investing a lot of money into that, and we want to make sure that they're protected too. And a lot of the negativity about this bill several years ago tried to pit it industrial hog farms versus row crops or different sectors of the industry. This is not simply a livestock or poultry issue. This is row crops. This is urban farming. This is timber. This is any sector of agriculture this will impact. When you think about what goes on, say, on a cotton farm, there's certain things that happen throughout the growing seasons, spraying pesticides, everything along those lines that we do on our farms, and we think nothing of them. The public thinks something bad is going on. You think about the things that we understand in agriculture, we have to think how that looks to somebody that's never grown a crop. Pesticide registrations and everything used to be very science and research based. Now they're becoming more and more emotional, more and more political about which side believes these things are right or wrong. We see that. We work on FIFRA, which is the federal registration for pesticides and herbicides and other things. We see that every time that registration comes up, that we're no longer just looking at the science. Now we're looking at how people feel about that science or how people feel about that technology. And we're going to see that continue to be a problem in all of agriculture. And we're going to see that as our neighbors move in. It's going to be much more of an emotional case when they look at what's happening on a farm, and that's whether it's livestock or row crop or fruit and vegetable, whatever it is. They're going to have those questions, and we're seeing more of that pop up around the country regarding nuisance lawsuits. But with that, I'll turn it over to Andres, and happy to answer any questions once everyone has a chance to talk.
Thank you, Will. Good morning, everyone. My name is Andres Villegas. I'm the president and CEO of the Georgia
many of you know this already, but we were started in 1907 to be the voice of the forestry community. Today, that represents $36 billion of economic impact on an annual basis to our economy, the second largest part of our state's economy, and about 22 million acres of primary land use in the state of Georgia. And so that makes us the number one forestry state in the nation. That's something that we should all be proud of, and that you have a responsibility to continue to create the environment that we can continue being number one too as well. When I throw out that $36 billion number, about 10 years ago, we were only at $18 billion or so. We've grown a lot, and we can continue growing too as well, adding great paying jobs that put people in the middle class and give them an opportunity to raise a family. For us, one of the things that we want to do at GFA is grow. That's one of our slogans, and so I'm pleased to introduce Craig Anderson. Craig, if you wouldn't mind standing up in the background. Craig is our new Director of Government Affairs. He's joining us. Many of you know Tom Byer, who's moved on to another opportunity. So Craig is a familiar face that hopefully you'll be able to see at the Capitol moving forward. Well, I appreciate the opportunity to speak to you today about right to farm. Obviously, this is an important issue for us. The right to farm bill gives us, in particular, a lot of protection for our large industrial facilities. So think about all the sawmills that are scattered around the state of Georgia. We're number 3 in sawmill production in the nation. Think about all the pulp mills that are scattered around Georgia. We have more pulp and paper mills than any other state in the nation, and they played a critical role as our economy has shifted heavily to e-commerce, and just about everybody's getting an Amazon box on their front doorstep at some point this month, as well as making face masks and tissues and all these other things. It's a critical part of our economy, whether that's in the middle of a pandemic and responding to emergency needs that we have, or whether that's making sure that our economy continues moving and evolving into new things. There's other laws in other areas of the code that protect things like timber harvesting and prescribed burning. And as Will stated earlier, there's a lot of things that we do that we've been doing for a long time, but those mills where they were never built, oftentimes we're in the middle of nowhere. And today, the great example is in Valdosta with the Langdale mills. The city has grown up around them. Look at our mills in Savannah, our mills in Brunswick, and other areas. The neighborhoods have come to us. And more importantly, with 10 million Georgians, where 8 million of them basically live in urban areas, that disconnect with what happens in our rural economies, what's happening on farms, what's happening in mills, that employ tens of thousands of people, happens every single day. And so there can be misconceptions about the things we do and whether or not they're safe, whether or not they're okay, that are only going to increase over time. So the right to farm statutes for us are absolutely critical to our operations and to the longevity of multi-billion-dollar assets that are in the state moving into the future. We're very fortunate, though, that the current Georgia law is much stronger than many other states around the Southeast or around the nation. We have really well-defined definitions for agriculture and forestry operations. We also, if you're going to take action, it's limited typically to negligent operators, people who are outside of the bounds of the law. We also have done a great job of defining change conditions and also urban sprawl. And then ultimately, we also protect those operators who are doing what we want them to do. Those big mills that invest in new technology, that expand, that double their capacity. In the southeastern United States, there's been a huge investment in sawmills over the past 5 years. Georgia has gotten about a third of all of that investment across 16 southern states, doubling the capacity of most of our sawmills. That's a big deal, especially when we saw what was happening with lumber prices earlier this year, right? Everybody wanted a 2x4, it seems like, right? But our state's ability to respond to that was front and center. At the same time, those types of expansions are protected by our current right to farm statutes. So we have a strong law. Now, does that mean it's as strong as it can be? No. I think there's great opportunities for us to be able to expand on those. One is, and you'll see this in your one pager that we've given you here, the opportunity to and this was included in the original bill that was introduced a couple years ago, but really foreclose on nuisance suits 1 year after operations start for facilities. That's one of those opportunities where we have to really kind of protect what we have and ensure that new entrants into the space, whether they be urban or rural, have that opportunity to have additional coverage. I guess the last thing for us is that our door is absolutely always open. You can reach out to me. You can reach out to Craig. We also have Brittany Hull here with PCA back in the back of the room too as well. One of our large pulp mills located out of Valdosta, Georgia. These issues are critical to us. Maintaining the protections we have and not going backwards is that do no harm. It's something that I think we all appreciate when we're at the Capitol. You on your side and us on our side. But more importantly, exploring these opportunities. So we look forward to working with you on these issues and our colleagues as well. Thank you. Mr. Chairman, members of the council, my name is Jake Matthews. I'm with Georgia Farm Bureau's Public Policy Department. I appreciate the opportunity to be here with y'all this morning. They've already done a great job of kind of laying out the issue. I don't want to reiterate too much of what they've already said, but Georgia Farm Bureau represents agriculture in Georgia as a whole. I mean, everything, like our president, his former colleague likes to say, everything from apples to zucchinis. So we cover it all. This issue, right farm, is the number one priority for us. We just got back from our convention down in Jekyll Island, and just talking with folks down there, it's very clear to see that this is what's on their mind. This is the number one issue. Just want to highlight a couple of things that they did mention, but it's very important for us, and like I said, they've already covered it very well. This issue is very important for existing farms, but it's also extremely important for new farmers. We want to ensure that we're closing these loopholes that they've already talked about for existing farms, but new farms as well. If we're trying to boost rural Georgia, increase prosperity in those areas, it's very important to make sure that the opportunity is there for people to come in, start a new farm, and make sure that they have protection and are comfortable doing that. The population in the population of the state is growing, and like they said, it's sometimes expanding into these rural areas, and that expansion is causing that's the issue at hand here. So it's been misunderstood as something in the past as subverting clean air, clean water laws, all sorts of kind of crazy stuff. But we want to emphasize the fact that this is dealing strictly with nuisance. That is the only thing that it deals with. If there is someone out there that is breaking the law, is polluting water, doing anything like that, this does not deal with that. There are other avenues to fix those sort of issues. This deals strictly with nuisance. It's like I said, it's the number one issue for us. It's important for existing farmers. It's important for new farmers. I don't want to kind of go on too long and repeat everything they said, but I'm very glad to answer any questions that y'all might have.
All right. Well, Chairman Parker, you want to get started? I'll start. I guess I just wanted to, before I forget the thought. So our current law has some strong protections in place. But one of the things I guess that we're all agreed on is that we need to, the 1 year change condition needs to, after 1 year, there's no suits that can be filed unless someone is operating illegally, improperly, breaking the law. That's one of the, we share that perspective from the Forestry Association. Mike, you look like you want to say something.
And that's essentially true, but the law doesn't prevent a suit from being filed, either currently or as ideally as it would be proposed. It just provides an opportunity for the defendant to present this as a defense if sued.
So, and Mr. Chairman, I want to add too that our law is what we think is fairly strong, but also other states have very, very similar laws, because a lot of the laws were passed in the 80s that were very similar, and they've had cases that the judges have ruled in a very narrow, technical way to say that people have, maybe not these specific people, but people in general had been in that area, so therefore the condition did not change just because it wasn't these people that lived here before. People had generally been in that area, and I think if you look at Georgia, people have generally been in all areas of our state. So we do think that the law was written with a understanding and a thought, and even clearly stated in the intro to the bill, saying that it's the desire of the legislature to protect agriculture. We think that a judge could rule in that very narrow and technical way against what we have, because it's similar to what's been done in other states.
Okay. And so I guess, and I know there's probably hundreds of examples and scenarios, and you don't want to go down a crazy path, but so if I'm we raise beef and we have cattle on the farm, but if my daughters decide to build a processing facility that we talked about yesterday on the farm, have I changed condition? Or is that?
change condition relative to the law, current and likely as proposed, is external to your farm. It has nothing to do with what you do on your farm.
But you would have changed your operation fundamentally in some technical and narrow definitions there. So maybe some exposure with that change.
Okay. Chairman Purdy.
So y'all brought some pretty interesting thoughts about the right of farm legislation that I actually hadn't thought about. So in the rural setting that we were thinking of, smells and dust and maybe natural fertilizers and that type of thing. But you brought a very interesting point about the timing of applications in rural and in urban settings, because this is an ag bill and not just a rural bill. For instance, studies have shown that fungicide applications are more effective after dark. So you're able to get more fungicide to the root, to the bottom of the plant when the leaves pull away. And so some fungicide applications, lights and dust and such, would be after dark. Similarly, harvest does not necessarily stop at dark. When you have a front coming through, when you have the crop ready, it's not an 8 to 5 deal. It is much more intensive with relation to the calendar and to the clock. That when it's time, and it's time sensitive, and you get it out. And I can understand some of the, if you think it's an 8 to 5, and this is only when we harvest. I can imagine in a more urban setting that there would be a learning curve to what goes on after dark in a farming enterprise. So that was a good point. Thank you.
Chairman Taylor.
I guess it's a question or a statement of something that happened down in my district, and we're seeing family farms be separated, parcels are sold off, family members get it, and we had one in particular, the family had split up the property, and one of the non-residents, most of them built houses on their little 10, 20 acres, somebody came in and wanted to put up chicken houses next to what was homes. They might have been on 10 acres, and the now former county commissioners gave them the permits, and they were able to put up numerous chicken houses. How is that? That is a change of condition because they're not using the land for farming. They did do it, and it's fine. We've got chicken houses, but the people around there were quite upset about it because it changed the atmosphere around there. Does that apply? Would this law apply to it?
In that scenario, the building of the chicken houses would not be a change condition. But I guess fundamentally, when you look at whether or not the development of agricultural operations like a chicken house are allowed, that really I think falls back on constitutional authority of local governments to decide where it's appropriate to build any
It did.
type of
It's agriculture. Frankly, the county doesn't even have any zoning. You're out in the country and you could do what you wanted, and they did. But it made some unhappy neighbors. I guess that would be what it was. But it was also economically good for the community. So it was, again, I think we're seeing more of that. And I guess my real point was seeing some of the farms broken up. So they're not being used in the way that they had been. Thank you.
I understand how the system works now, but it's confusing. And if that's what's in the bill, maybe it does need another name and another way of going at it. And I would suggest that you not put urban things together with the rural part, because, and where I live, and everybody will be up in arms over it at the same time. And it isn't the problem in what we have, even in one of the areas in Cobb County. It's not an agriculture thing, but a plant was given permission, had been there 20 years or so, and then the commissioners allowed a subdivision to build up right next to it. To me, that's the problem is that who's there first? And it seems like there ought to be just some really clear protections that you were there functioning before somebody decided to move next door, or the commissioners of an area decided to let you build there. That's what needs to be defined, and that kind of protection needs to be put in to really make sure that you can continue to farm. Am I wrong?
No, I think you're right, and that is essentially what current law does. It deals with that concept of coming to the nuisance.
Yeah, but it's confusing to
It
people.
is, yeah, it is, and we think that's the other element to this. We think that that all of the scenarios that could potentially be a change condition are very hard to define. I mean, we've thought about ways, how can you improve the definitions, and then you think of another scenario that complicates the matter.
I mean, it seems like to me we just ought to say if you were there first, you're not breaking the law, and you've been operating, under those conditions, you have the right to stay there and function as long as you don't do something illegal. It seems like it's pretty clear to me that that'd be a simple way to write it, and I'd certainly vote for it.
I wonder, Chairman Dickey, if y'all share the microphone over there.
Thank you. And Chairwoman, that is the problem we have. It's this bill is really protection from litigation. And when you get attorneys, how many attorneys are in here? My goodness. We can all give scenarios, and we can all talk and have good explanation on the ground, but when trial attorneys get involved, they can absolutely put farms and agribusiness out of business through litigation, and that's what we're trying to protect from. And these definitions, attorneys can just pick it apart and change it, and that's why it's been so complicated to get this bill passed, and why Chairman Walker and I did not push the bill last year, but we are working diligently as we speak on a bill that's coming this year. Chairman Walker and I both are going to have a bill and hope we can get it right, and I don't think we'll ever please the litigators, trial lawyers, okay? So that is what happened to this bill last time in the Senate. We got it through the House just fine, and then that's where it died 2 years ago there. So we're working hard, and thank you for this group up here that's been working with us and still working with us to try to get a bill that will pass but be effective. I mean, there's no need for us to try to pass something that's just not going to be effective. So that's where we are, and thank y'all for all the help and the support you get. But it's going to take everybody to try to get this bill through.
I support the bill. Thank you guys for moving in this direction. I want to follow up a little bit on Representative Taylor's comments that had to do with farms breaking up in a little different directions. Anybody, maybe this is David's question, I don't know, concerned about these rich software companies gobbling up these large farmlands, and how that might lead possibly to the looming food shortage that we got? Y'all want to tackle that?
Yeah, that's Chairman Stevens. That's a great question, and it's actually, since really the 2000s we've seen, or 1990s we've seen a huge shift in land usage in the state of Georgia and the Southeast in general, but Georgia in particular. As we from the timber side, companies that were vertically integrated like International Paper, Georgia Pacific, that owned a lot of timberland in the state, Weyerhaeuser as well, made decisions to sell off those assets and spin them off into other companies. Some of those were driven by taxes. Georgia has the highest timberland taxes of any state in the Southeast. You guys have done a lot of work to help us get that down, but it's still the highest in the Southeast, and we all know that carrying costs are, when you have a lot of assets, they're considerable to your bottom line. But what we've seen is a new wave of changes that are coming, and are coming fast. A lot of them driven around carbon. And so if you look at the folks that are getting in the space, in particular tax is enough to buy the entire forestry industry in the United States in 1 year. And so when companies like that need to find offsets fast, we're a rich target because our trees grow really well in the state. We've got a lot of them, billions and billions and billions of them. And they don't necessarily look at it as a timber resource that's going to feed mills and generate exports and lumber for housing and all these other things. They look at it as a carbon sink that they can use for compliance and offsets and things along those lines. It flips on its head the entire concept of investing in land to grow a crop, whether that's for food or for fiber or for the other things that we have in the state. It flips it completely on its head because the investor's not looking for that. They're looking for a new asset, which is carbon. So I think it's very important for us as we continue down this journey of policies and market mechanisms to address climate, that we keep a very close eye on what that can have. Because someone who owns timber that just wants to leave the trees alone, that's not good for our industry. It's also not good for our environment. We understand and we see when we look at those massive fires in California and other places, what happens when you leave it alone. And a tree that's not harvested means that we're not building with wood either, which is not good for our state. We're the number 3 lumber producer in the nation. That's not good for our state. So we've seen a big change already that happened from the 1990s until today, and we're bracing for what could be another really massive change too as well, and making sure that it doesn't mean that if there's new owners that bad decisions will be made. It does mean that we need to do everything we can to help them understand what sound management, sustainable management looks like, and how important that is to our economy in the state of Georgia.
Thank you. Chairman, can I add to that? I think several years ago you saw some of the richest people in the world buy farmland in Georgia, and then you saw them quickly exit. So I think that tells you a little bit about how hard it is to farm. So I think how expensive it is if some of the billionaires that own some of the biggest companies in the world can't make it work on paper. I think that just shows the importance of protecting our industry because it's a really, really hard thing to do, but it's really, really important to our whole society, especially to our state.
Back to what you're talking about, the demand for the carbon credit, I guess.
Yes, sir.
Who determines the carbon value of property? Do we have any say so in that?
Right now it's a market. So primarily in the voluntary markets in California, it's more of a regulated market, but it's still kind of a market-oriented action. The value of carbon credits has ranged from a quarter to $200, $300, $400, $500.
So they're not having to buy like per acre. They're not getting so much carbon credit.
Yes, sir. It all depends on how much you grow. So if you have a lot of trees and they grow fast and they're genetically improved and all these other things, and they're on good soil, you're going to grow more carbon essentially. But if you look at Morgan Stanley and some of the projections of what carbon can be worth right now, they're projecting anywhere from $250 to $5,000 per ton.
Okay.
And so we're very much on the lower end of that right now. And most of the big companies that are in our sector, in the forestry sector, are waiting. A great example is in New Zealand, where they have a mandatory regulated market, kind of like California. In 1 year, prices have gone up about 150%. And so if you're sitting on all that carbon, you're saying, well, why would I sell it cheap now if I know that, a year or 2 or 3 or 4 from now it'll be worth, a lot more. So it's all market generated.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think to me it's just important to have a real example every now and then. In Northwest Georgia, you're in the Senate committee a couple years ago, had a farmer come in talking about a poultry farmer in Northwest Georgia who's being extorted by an attorney up there who is bringing a nuisance lawsuit, puts the farmer in having to get an attorney to defend it, but they'll settle it for $50,000. And that has been a repetitive thing going on up there with an attorney. And this is what I hope passing this will prevent. Because these are family farms, 3 chicken houses, 6, not 40. But that's something that's a real thing that's going on there. And Chairman Cooper, your idea might be the simplest, but it's pervasive in our area.
Anybody else? Dr. Bridges, comment?
I'd like to if the sheep are the cause of the nuisance problems.
Representative Williams.
Sure, I agree with that, and also just to add to that comment too as well. Our forests also provide more than just fiber. It's wildlife habitat, it's air, it's water. About 6.5 million Georgians depend on forest to filter the water that hits the streams and then go into the intakes for our communities in North Georgia. And so it's fundamental to our survival at the end of the day, to be able to breathe and drink water and also eat and do other things. So, well, yes, sir.
Anybody else? All right. Well, I don't see any more questions. Y'all, thank you for being here and look forward to talking about this a lot more going forward. Chairman Dickey and Chairman Walker. It's an important issue. So thank y'all for being here. Appreciate what you do.
Okay, next up in our discussion coming up is the emerging industry of oyster hatcheries, and unfortunately for the last year or two, our oyster farmers have not gotten to come to the Capitol and give us that lunch. We have oysters and seafood from the coast, and we sure miss it, but we look forward to hearing from you guys and what's going on and what we can do to help you. If you want any more apple pies, see where Blake is right there in the corner. There's a box full. And so help yourself right back there. Not anymore? Oh, okay. Guys, you got the floor.
All right. Thank you, Chairman and members of the council. My name is Tom Bliss. I'm with the University of Georgia Marine Extension and Georgia Sea Grant, and I'm going to talk to you today about the work we've been doing with oysters here along with the state, and just kind of put together a brief PowerPoint to talk to you about what we're excited about, not only how we grow oysters briefly, but also the potential economic impact that we think can come from it. And so with that, let's see. So, all right. Thank you. And so with that, just real quickly, I just wanted to put up this slide showing what our seafood landings value are. A little closer? Okay, I can do that. All right, and this is just from 2019, and you'll see that on the value that, shrimp and blue crab are definitely our largest landings, but you'll notice number 3 is clams, and that is our number species. But if you look towards the bottom of the very top, you'll notice that oysters are down near the bottom, and that is something that we're very excited with the legislation that was passed in 2019 that we can see a turnaround on and stuff like that. So we're very excited at that potential. And just a little bit of background on clams before we get into oysters. Our first commercial operation started in 1990, and clam landings that year you could see were just about $23,000. In 2019, they were up to 1.8 million. So we've seen tremendous growth in that sector of aquaculture, and we think oysters have the potential to do the same, if not be a little bit larger, actually. So we're very excited at the opportunity to see that grow. And just if you're not familiar with our natural oysters, they're a wonderful animal to eat. They're great, grow well in our waters, but they grow in clumps. And when Georgia led the country in oyster harvest, it was for the canning industry, so we didn't care what the oyster looked like. Today, the demand is for a nice single oyster, and really that is what people want. And to do that, you've got to go towards a more aquaculture intensive, gear-driven process, and also using hatchery-produced seed. And so we were fortunate to get a grant from our friends at the Department of Natural Resources in 2014 to actually establish a hatchery at our lab on Skidaway Island, with the goal of actually getting oyster seed in the state at the time to start doing research and doing some work with the individuals that had leases to get their input on how they wanted to proceed with oyster aquaculture, because there was a lot of interest in developing that industry here. They were seeing what was going on in our adjacent states, and they wanted to be part of that. And so there was a lot of interest in it, but at the time, Georgia could not import oyster seed due to the current rules at the time. So this gave us the ability to produce seed so we could start doing research. And that really helped facilitate, get things moving along. And then we've gotten continued support through legislation in our budget to keep the hatchery open. And this year we were able to provide about 1.6 million oyster seed or spat to growers to get out on leases this year. So we have oysters in the water, and so it's exciting to see it start taking root here. And once that seed leaves our hatchery, it can go out onto two types of leases, either an intertidal lease or a floating lease, which is the whole new type of lease that was established in the legislation. And the bottom leases, we can grow a very good crop, but it is more labor intensive and takes about a year and a half to get a marketable size oyster, and we don't have as good a survival. When we get to the water column leases, there you can float that oyster, you get a lot more growth, better survival, and so that is really what the industry is looking to go to. And as you look around the nation, you see that most of the other states are going more towards the floating, and then they'll have a mix of other styles in there as well. But what we're excited about is through our research, we've been able to help develop some oyster budgets so that individuals wanting to get into this industry, they can start looking ahead and planning, because this is all new to Georgia. So we're trying to educate those individuals that are getting leases or interested in leases and how to plan for this and what they can expect. But the exciting part from this is our coastal economist was then able to take the work from our research and looking at other states and start projecting what the potential economic impact would be to the state of Georgia. And so by looking at the number of acres under production for oysters, he could estimate what our landings value would be and the potential number of jobs that would be created. So you can see with 50 acres under production, they estimate about 35 jobs created and landings of about $3 million. And then as you grow up, that just adds up. So it seems to be about 35 to 40 jobs for every 50 acres under production. And so that is something that is, can be tweaked on as we get farms in the water and start really seeing what happens. But that does give us some idea of what the possibilities are here for the state of Georgia. And then, along those lines, we were very interested in what was going on in other states adjacent to us. And Shauna Jones with our Institute of Government, she couldn't be here today, but she and her colleagues started looking at when other states in the Southeast started to pass oyster legislation and what their landings value were and how their is definitely, when you look at the East Coast, they are a state that has taken a lot of time and support to get that industry to grow. They completely overhauled their oyster industry in the early 2000s. They actually shut down production for a year and went heavily into aquaculture. And you can see that just in about 15 to 20 years, they're now up to over $40 million a year in landings in Virginia. And then probably in the southeast, the one most close that represents Georgia and what the potential is was Alabama. Alabama started farming in 2013, and you can see that now they have landings of about $1 million a year between that 2017-19. So really good growth there, and we think that Georgia can easily meet that and hopefully surpass that one as well. And with that, the other thing that drives the amount of oysters is where the leases are and how the leases are put together. So this is just what Shauna put together, looking at how different states handle leases and if there's support in those states from a state-supported hatchery and information like that. And you can see that it runs the board. Every state does it a little bit differently. And I know it's not my forte, so I'm glad Doug and Dominic are here to be able to speak on behalf of the leasing ways and what they see for the state of Georgia. And then, with that, a lot of times when we get, comments and questions at our office, specifically from people wanting to get into the industry and grow, a lot of it does go around seed access. Obviously, if you don't have oyster seed, you don't have oysters to put in the water. So having a good number of hatcheries is very important. Currently in Georgia, we still are the only we are the only shellfish hatchery in the state of Georgia, and South Carolina has one very small private hatchery. So, we would love to see investment in hatcheries to be able to facilitate this industry. We are able, through the university, to provide seed commercially at this time, but that is not our long-term goal. Our goal is to help facilitate and help be a catalyst for the industry, but in time pull back and focus solely on research. A lot of other questions that come in are summer harvest. When will summer harvest be approved? And we're currently have some funding from Sea Grant to do some testing on that, and been working with DNR to get an experimental site set up so we can get that out this year to start running those samples. And then a lot of other things come in are really from people if they're interested in hatcheries, what are the economics behind it. So we have some information, but we also have a coastal economist that we can direct them to, which is good. We get a lot of concern about leases, where they are, when they'll come available. Those questions we give to our DNR, pass them to them, they answer. And really where our focus is really moving now is that public perception. As we start building this industry, what are people's thoughts and minds of oyster aquaculture? It's not something that they're used to seeing down here. So Shauna Jones and her group are starting to do some surveys, and then that will help us lead into doing some outreach and education to really try and get out to those coastal communities and let them know what's coming. So that's really where our focus will be, as in addition to the growing of oysters, what we want to focus on in the coming future. And then just to briefly mention, in addition to oysters, what are our focuses as a lab for research purposes? As hatcheries come along board, we want to be able to provide really good quality brood stocks. That means working on genetics and improved lines of oysters, very similar to what's done in ag. So we're just starting to work on that at the lab, but we're also interested in expanding other species such as our native blood arc, and then also working with our southern clam species to, diversify the industry a little bit more. And then as another stream of revenue for potential hatcheries as they move in is to also work with communities when they get into restoration. So we currently have some money from the Department of Natural Resources to look at some spat-on-shell application as it comes to oyster restoration, and that can also go into living shoreline use and stuff like that to help make our coastlines more resilient to the changes that we're starting to see. And then our rim mussel is one of those as well. So that is a real you, and, I don't want to take up all the time, so I'll end it there and just say thank you, and then, look forward to questions.
You want to
Go next, Brian?
Yeah, sure. All right. I don't know. Can you hear me? Good morning, y'all. Thanks for having me. My name is Brian Rackley. I am, I'm several things. I'm going to go over those quickly. The first is I'm a partner at a restaurant in Decatur, Georgia called Kimball House. We are an 88-seat restaurant in downtown Decatur. We've been open since September of 2013. And one thing that we've been very good at executing is the service of raw oysters, cooked oysters, just shellfish in general. That has created a lot of opportunities for me, and I think that they've been really important in getting me to where I am now, because for us, one of the biggest hurdles was distribution of shellfish, and we found a lot of flaws in those distributions, and so we started working directly with a lot of shellfish farmers, and that's created a lot of lasting, great relationships for us personally, but it's also taught us a ton. And we've just learned a lot about what shellfish farmers are doing, what their needs are, what their expectations are, and a lot of what their problems are. At the restaurant in general, I kind of want to throw some numbers at you. It doesn't necessarily have to mean a lot to you now, but if they rattle around, then good. Maybe something will remind you of them later. So far in 2021, and this is in spite of a pretty bad Q1. Q1 was still pretty grossly affected by COVID. But we've sold over a couple 100,000 oysters at our little restaurant this year, just raw oysters. I don't know if you had your TVs on this past weekend, but I think we're all tired of losing Alabama. But our number one seller was actually an Alabama oyster, and it was diverse after that. It was a Massachusetts oyster, a Washington oyster, and then in fifth were the E.L. McIntosh oysters from Ernest McIntosh on our coast here in Georgia. And that's in spite of them being closed for most of Q3. So I think what we have here is promising. The demand for Georgia shellfish is completely built in. And it's kind of a scenario where once we can kind of get out of our own way, we're going to sell a ton of Georgia oysters. We just need to get to the starting line, and it looks like we're making progress. So I look forward to seeing where we are this time next year. The other thing that I'm a member of that I hope we can use to accelerate, Georgia oysters just in general is I'm a founding board member of a regional nonprofit called Oyster South. And what we do is a lot of it is cheerleading. We raise awareness, try to create events and causes that perpetuate the popularity and sale of southern oysters. We do a big fundraiser every year. We've had several programs that have come out of those fundraisers that have positively benefited aquaculture in the South. And it's been one of those scenarios where it's created a lot of opportunities for us to learn through farmers, because this is it's not necessarily a growers association, but the primary member in this organization are growers. It's a network, it's a community, but it also incorporates restaurateurs, writers, just enthusiasts in general, and it brings in a lot of people that we kind of need to continue to, we need to share the information like a growers association would, but we also need people to go back to their respective communities and talk about how great these oysters are, tell their friends and families about how good southern cultured oysters are. So people will continue to buy them, and we can continue to educate people on the safety aspects of them, how it is a 12-month-a-year business, and it has to be, because I can't live only getting paid 7 months a year, and I don't know that you can either. But so something we all kind of want to continue to consider when we talk about Georgia oysters and Georgia oyster legislation as we move forward.
The third thing that I've kind of become as a result of these relationships and just my own personal desires is an actual shellfish farmer. I have, me and my business partners have 3 acres in Spring Creek, Florida. And we're not, Georgia wasn't on the table at the time. So it wasn't like we had to choose between Georgia and Florida. It's a place that I'm very passionate about. I have an emotional attachment to this area. And I haven't really given a ton of thought to where we're at with Georgia oysters. And I've had people ask, and I'm like, I'm not real sure. I think we're just kind of hung up. It'll happen when it happens. If anything, at this point in time in my life, the one thing I've learned at least a little bit better is some patience. So I'm just like, yeah, I have a little patience. But anyways, I got a call from a peer that was very interested in Georgia aquaculture recently. And I'm also was kind of involved with the steering committee to try to think about some ways to make Georgia aquaculture successful. So I did dive in, and I started looking at the legislation that we have here in Georgia and some of the things that we've had to go through in Florida, and trying to think about what the pros and cons are to each. And there's there's a couple of components about our legislation in Georgia that I think are excellent. There's the fact that people are responsible for their own mess. I think is great because you kind of inherit a mess once a lease turns over in Florida. There's not any actual penalty for you leaving your cruddy gear in the water. So I'm a big fan of some of those components like that. But when I was looking at this stuff with a friend, I came across some things that I thought could be problems for the industry as it tries to grow. And I know that Tom just mentioned the summer harvest, and the summer harvest is something that you probably need to address as soon as possible. It's just, there's some folks that have diversity in their portfolio so they can switch gears and do something else. But if you're talking about attracting new leaseholders and new business owners, if they don't have something to fall back on during the summer months, there's just no income, and I'm not really sure how to rectify that. I mean, it's kind of like the old minor league baseball player that has to go get a job washing cars in the summer. So, I think that in terms of how we want to sell Georgia aquaculture in general, we have to make it as attractive as possible. And being able to do business year round is something that I think is going to be very important to potential leaseholders. A couple of other things that I saw that I think that we should be wary of is, number one, the instrument of proof for the money that is going to be required. So they're saying that it's going to be, CRD has suggested it's going to cost about $75,000 to start an oyster farm. And that's completely accurate. I mean, if you farm oysters for any given period of time at all, you're definitely going to spend $75,000. But the burden of proof for that is maybe not as important as being able to actually start the process. Having proof of $70,000 at once, I know a lot of people that it would alienate. They wouldn't be able to do it. And there's a couple of things that I think can happen as a result of that are very positive. Number one, we're going into a brand new industry here in Georgia. The learning curve is going to be tricky, and people are they're gonna change their minds about their gear. They're going to change their minds about how they want to farm in general. So going all in at once is probably something that I would discourage. People are going to lose oysters, and that's just the simple fact of the matter when they're trying to learn their waters, they're trying to learn their substrate. They're going to be dealing with outside factors that they don't yet know. So starting small is honestly the best place to start. I had a quick call yesterday with Bill Walton from Auburn, who is kind of the southern founder of aquaculture in our region, and a lot of the really successful farms out of Alabama came off of the water park that he was using in Portersville Bay, Alabama. And I was like, Bill, how many oysters did you start people with when you were training them how to farm? He was like, 20,000, and that was just so they could feel some heat. So 20,000 oysters was enough to make first-year farmers feel the panic place of privilege where I have a business that I could leverage to get a loan to get into oyster farming, but I didn't have the money. I couldn't show you that I had it sitting around. And that kind of leads to the other topic that I know has been a little bit hot for some of the folks who are interested in Georgia aquaculture, and that's the lottery, because, you know, it does kind of make, you've got a lot of chicken and egg scenarios happening with the lottery, and if you're not a person who is, again, that select group that has cash to just take right into the business, you need to borrow money. You kind of have to show somebody a plan, and if your plan doesn't include a sure thing, I find that it creates a pretty significant hurdle into finding finances that you need to get into the business at all. I know that if somebody was wanting to borrow money from me to start an oyster farm, I would kind of want to know, like, do you have a lease? So I think that the difficulties from that can be solved, but it's just one of those things that I think makes signing on to the oyster industry here slightly less attractive. One other thing that I would like to bring up from my end, because this is something I've experienced and the farmers that we work with have experienced as well, is there's the fee attached to cage permitting. So in Georgia, the law is going to require you to have your cages permitted in groups of 25 and pay $1 per cage. I don't think the dollar is going to be the deal breaker here. The dollar is what it is, and I don't think it's going to offend anybody that much. But what I have seen is that oysters grow fast, and they grow faster than people who are new farmers are going to expect, and stuff simply gets away from you. You could show up one day and you're like, holy hell, I have a ton of work to do. I have to do it now. I don't have the gear on hand. I need to make a purchase, and I need to make it now. So I understand CRD probably is using that dollar per cage to come up with their own budget, and I think that they can get that dollar, but it might just be a scenario where we can look at what if we were taking the dollar on the tags instead of the bags, because someone ultimately is going to have to process those oysters before they're sold, and someone's going to have to put a tag on them, and I think you can find the money another way without having to make people scramble for gear. I know that for us personally in our marina, a guy that I work with who's probably the smartest guy I've ever met, I'm just like, how often are you having to run to the store to buy stuff? There's an oyster company down the road in Panacea called Outlaw Oyster Company, and Danita there sells gear, but she doesn't keep regular office hours. And I'm like, how do you even keep up with this? He's like, oh, I have a key. So he just goes in and takes gear whenever he needs it and writes it on a dry erase board. And that's what I'm getting at, is that's how critical time can be. When you need gear, you need it then, and you can't wait on permits. Additionally, with gear, people are they're going to change their minds about what gear they're using. So I know that when we're talking about Georgia aquaculture, a lot of it is based on cages. Cages are very difficult to work with. So one thing that I think we should be mindful of when we're talking about the lottery and the money is the people that we're alienating. And you know, if I'm looking just generally at two types of people who are, and this is very, very unspecific, well, two types of people that you might run into that are going to want to farm oysters. One of them is the retired lawyer, and one of them is the 30-year-old guy who has a kid at home. One guy is going to have less access to money, and one guy is going to have more access to time and management, and probably have skin in the game that means I have to turn this into a successful business. I've seen over the years between Oyster South, my farm in Florida, and just knowing people in the business, that there's a lot of folks that sign up for this, that it turns out that this is just harder than they thought it was going to be. So having flexibility with gear and having diversity with our leaseholders is going to be super important to this industry in general. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. If you have any questions, I'm happy to make some up. Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the council. My name is Doug Hamans. I'm the director of the Coastal Resources Division of the Georgia Department of Natural Resources. With me today is Dominic Guadagnoli. Dominic's going to be giving you a presentation laws, and they were in place since the 30s and had been amended over time. But 501 was a sea change, which would allow for the growth of mariculture. So thank you for that. It wasn't a straightforward, easy process, but I'll tell you what we did do was go in, and we heard this an awful lot, was we need to do what South Carolina's doing, we need to do what Florida's doing, or vice versa. So that's what we did, was we went to our neighboring states, we asked them what worked, what they wish they would have done from the beginning, what would they do if they had to do all over again. And a lot of what was incorporated into 501 came from those other states and the practices that they put in place. I also wanted to mention the fact that Tom didn't mention that this is a partnership at this table, right? The Department of Natural Resources is the regulatory arm, and we work with the growers every day in making sure that they implement things. If you think about it, oysters are one of the very few animal products that we consume raw on a daily basis, and the public health concern over consuming raw oysters is high. And so we need to make sure that when we implement this industry, that we do it in a careful, deliberative process to protect public health. Tom at the University of Georgia is the innovator, right? He's working with the farmers on the gear. He's working with them on a variety of topics. And individually, we couldn't do this apart from each other. So it is a partnership, and I appreciate Tom coming up. And then, we have Brian, who's the ultimately not the end consumer, but he's that middleman who's getting it to the end consumer. And so we all have a very vested interest, although we come at it from slightly different angles. And we could spend the rest of the day debating some of the things that Brian has brought up, and we can talk about a couple of them in this presentation. But I wanted to make sure that you understood that from a state regulatory standpoint, we're trying to keep the consumer safe while building a successful industry. Part of the issue with having the instrument of proof of funds to get in is to make that person who is applying for the lottery as successful as possible. We want them to know that when they get in that lottery, and if they're successful in winning one of the leases, that they've got the wherewithal to put it in play. And the process is there for them to go step by step, starting small and growing. That's the whole process, is to grow into a successful industry. I had a couple of notes I wanted to make sure. And the other thing, in addition to public health, is the public trust, right? This isn't privately owned farmlands where you heard the previous panel discussing. This is your waters. This is my waters. This is my kids' waters, right? And so whenever we segregate off parts of those waters to an individual to use, we need to make sure that it's done in a fair and equitable way. And so the rules and the rules of the DNR and the legislation that you guys put together for us help protect that. The reason we did a lottery was so that the highest bidder from out of state didn't come in and suck up. You guys are the Rural Development Council. You know your constituents, right? We were able to issue 3 leases this past summer in McIntosh County, and that runs the gamut from the highlighter, as he's called in the state, who won one of the leases, to Mr. E.L. McIntosh, who Brian mentioned they serve his oysters, right? So we're working with the spectrum out there of the oyster harvesters and trying to make it as level as we can for everybody. And I will say just right now a quick word about the cage fees, right? So it is $1 per cage in the legislation. But in the time that we have implemented the law to the time that we have put the first leases on the ground, things change. We were looking at initial cages of about 1,000 cages per lease. And that's quickly jumped to 14,400 cages per lease as the technology has changed. We don't expect to charge anybody $14,400 a year for cages. And so what the department has chosen to do is not to enforce cage fees this first year. And we will be coming back to you, not this year, but we will be coming back to you in the very near future to fix that. Instead, we went from $50 per acre on a lease to $150 per acre on a lease. The cost is still about the same, roughly $1,000, which we consider that resource rent. You're using a public trust resource for your private profit, and we feel like that's resource rent. But as this industry grows, as we develop, as you'll see what Dominic's talking about in just a second, there's going to be a few other things that we know we need to tweak. And so we want to come back to you, again, not in 2022, but perhaps 3 or 4, with a lot of different things that we want to tweak as one package to the shellfish plan. Yeah, so enough on that. I'll leave that there and turn it over to Dominic to let him tell you where we are in the last few years since the legislation's been in place and what's coming up this next year.
Thank you, Doug. And for sake of time, I've got quite a few slides. I'm going to run through them. You've already gotten a pretty good foundation of the program, but I'm going to hit on some of the things that what we do and what entails a shellfish program from a regulatory perspective. So, in general, if a state chooses to have shellfish in commerce, interstate shellfish in commerce, they have to participate in what's called the NSSP. It's the National Shellfish Sanitation Program. That program hinges on a document called the Model Ordinance. And that Model Ordinance is a document that is essentially it's the prescription, it's the Bible that we all use as regulators in the industry. The Model Ordinance is about 500, almost 550 pages long. It has guidance documents. It has quite a bit of the options in terms of how you would like to regulate your industry in your state. But it is fairly prescriptive. And of course, today I don't have the time to give you examples of what I'm describing. But keep that in mind as we go through. And I'm giving you sort of that, maybe not so much farmer perspective, but what is it going to take to be able to regulate this farmer in this state? And Doug already touched on the other priority. Our program, as all shellfish programs in other states, the priority is public health. It's really not agriculture. Agriculture is the secondary component. And that may or may not be what you think about when you think about shellfish program. So bear with me and I'll try to explain a few things to you. And let me double back and just a few things that I'll touch on in terms of what we do at SEAC Coastal Resources Division. Classification of water bodies and what's involved with classification. Growing area waters must be classified before those waters can be farmed. Also, lease management and permitting. In many states, that's in a different agency. We also do that at Coastal Resources Division. So that's another hat that we wear within our division. Harvester education and permitting, another requirement of the NSSP. So we're educating not only the leaseholder, but all of their employees. And we are audited annually in terms of whether or not we have done that in compliance and in conformance with the Model Ordinance. And then lastly, I mentioned recreational management. So we not part of this commercial industry, but we also at Coastal Resources Division manage recreational areas for folks that desire to do this recreationally. So, if you care to harvest your own oysters, there are also these areas that you can do so within our approved growing areas. Doug mentioned partnership as regulators. So we work hand in hand through the Model Ordinance. Our division is considered an authority. Our sister division, the Georgia Department of Agriculture, is an authority. And so if you think of shellfish and when that animal gets harvested out in the water, and then when it ends up in Brian's store or restaurant, if you would think of our division handles that animal in a regulatory capacity from when it's harvested to when it hits the dock. Our sister division picks that up at the dock and then carries that regulatory responsibility all the way to the consumer. So we work hand in hand, because if there's a broken link in that chain, we are going to know about it. And we're going to know about it, unfortunately, through an illness or even sadder if it's a fatality. And so those issues and those challenges in the program, we deal with day in and day out. And so the goal is, how do we keep from getting there? And so these are audited to ensure that they have enough surveillance within the growing area. So if you don't have adequate surveillance, then FDA will not allow us to have an industry. So folks may or may not have considered that, but that is also another factor. And then lastly, the Army Corps of Engineers. Those are our federal permitting partners in this process. I mentioned laboratory. We monitor 82 stations every month. And these are stations that give us data month after month so that we can look at water quality. And then also sanitary surveys, which gives us the ability to keep these areas in conformance with the model ordinance. I mentioned lease management and permitting, harvester and education and outreach. And again, we do this as the leaseholders acquire leases, change leases, or have different scenarios. We are there to ensure that they are educated as it's prescribed. And now a little bit about where we've come since the new legislation in 2019. So I'm not going to go through. Tom gave us a little bit of the history of the program and where we've come from. And so of significance, I wanted just to give a couple of growth patterns in terms of growth points that we've had over the last 2 years. And of course, not to mention, and hopefully optimistically, we've rounded the corner, but COVID had a significant impact on not only us, but our ability to try and grow and take this new program into the out of pilot and into implementation. And so 2020, we surprisingly were able to offer 5 opportunities. And so we had 5 intertitle leases that were offered at the end of 2020. Doug mentioned that we have opened our first 3 subtitle leases, and those were issued in McIntosh County. We are currently ready to offer 3 additional subtitle leases in Chatham County. And so that makes 6 subtitle floating farm opportunities in less than 2 years. And so in terms of perspective, and I know, we're, if not last, close to being last in the union to participate in this industry. So, but there's a lot of good things about coming in last because we've learned a lot. We've learned a tremendous amount from our neighbors. Wanted to make a quick point. So I work hand in hand with my colleagues in other states. South Carolina's had this industry, this new industry, since 2014. And so they're currently at roughly 10 leases after this period of time. So if you look at that in retrospect, I think we're doing fairly well in our state because apparently, what we're learning is it takes time. You don't get to Virginia overnight, and this isn't a house that we can build with the wrong foundation. So that is the point I want to reiterate, as Doug mentioned. A couple of things I want to make of note: the 3 leases in McIntosh and the 3 leases in Chatham County. Both of those have a mariculture zone associated with those. So we are taking an extra step to deal with what Doug had touched on, which was the public trust. These mariculture zones will be marked using the resources that we have been given through the legislative process. These areas will be marked with pilings and signage. We hope that those steps that we're taking now, which are significant deviations from what other states are dealing with, will help us with the growth of this industry and with a good public perception, which is extremely important. Wanted just to touch very briefly on some of the new things that will be coming. We've recently, still in the beta phase, but we are very close to putting out a dashboard which will give interested prospective growers started as of almost 2 weeks ago. During our public meeting, we presented a survey that we have now put out for interested growers to contact, to fill out the survey. Let us know what your interests are. Are they for intertidal water bottoms, subtidal water bottoms? We want to use this information to guide us in the future, so we can direct our resources and use that feedback from those that want to commit to the industry. And then briefly, just a mention on some of the challenges. So permitting is a challenge in every state with this industry. There are different degrees of time that it takes to get gear permitted. Doug mentioned public trust. These areas are in the public waters of the state, and so we have to ensure that our due diligence and then the due diligence that the federal agencies are ensuring that these areas, when they are permitted correctly. I mentioned the survey, and then lastly, wanted to mention that we are working with Tom and his staff to develop platforms, educational platforms here in the spring, to begin to host prospective growers and begin to educate them and introduce them to all of these agencies in a classroom field setting, which will hopefully give them a better understanding of what they're committing to, as leases become available. Thank you.
Thank you all. I just have a couple of questions, because we're running short on time in a minute. But the cost to start a hatchery, I think that's one thing that I'm just curious about. That I know y'all replicated. You don't have one, Thomas. So what would it cost an individual that wanted to put a hatchery in?
Well, I'll say as far as the biggest expense really is property, because you're going to have access to good water quality. And so for us, where we were, we inherited, the lab was built in the 70s, 80s with access on state lands to the Skidaway River, so we had that built in. So I'll say one of the biggest hindrances to hatcheries is just finding property that has access to water, good water quality. We've been approached by the city of St. Mary's and a few others that have had, they're very interested in developing some public-private partnerships. Unfortunately, a few of those sites just didn't, the water that they had access to wasn't sufficient for a hatchery. So I'll say that's probably going to be the biggest expense. Once you have the property and the infrastructure, I've seen hatcheries, and Dominic can speak to this as well, I've seen them cost millions of dollars to build, and I've seen them cost $100,000 or a couple $100,000 to build. So you can run the gamut on what you want to do there, but I'd say it's really just having access to good water quality.
And just also, can we use seed from other states? Is that where are we at with that now? We're not doing that.
So I'll pick up. So part of the legislation had basically established CRD as the authority to be able to authorize and certify both in-state and out-of-state hatcheries, and then we followed up with rules to specifically how that was going to be done. So we are actually currently have in our policies and rules the ability to certify an out-of-state hatchery that does desire to ship oyster seed into our state. So, and we have used the best management practices and a lot of the policies that exist in the Southeast region to ensure that all of those BMPs are being met. So it's not just a state issue, it's a regional issue.
Dominic, I would just like to add to that, because I know for us, and with Florida farms, seed is a huge problem. So I know in Georgia it seems like the requirements for the annual planting requirements are low, and I think that's part of the state legislation that I think is going to be very beneficial in terms of them learning how to farm. In Florida, within an acre and a half, they require you to plant 105,000 seed a year to keep your lease, and it's created a lot of really lousy practices. It causes people to end up just buying the seed shortage issue. So I would, I think that that's something that we should totally embrace here in Georgia, is that we are not requiring people to overexert themselves in terms of seed requirements.
Right. So the key there is balance. We're at 50,000 an acre.
50,000 is a good place to learn.
Okay.
It's right. The curve is tricky.
Correct. Correct. Mr. Al.
Let me say that, thank you, Doug, and everybody down there, and the commissioner. Had it not been for lotteries, probably wouldn't have been anybody from Georgia who would have gotten a lease. The deep pocket boys, which is good for some folk, but bad for Georgia. And for the first time, and I hate to inform you all, but the Chatham Day have not had Georgia oysters ever. Those oysters came out of Apalachicola until they crashed, because we have the best tasting oysters in the world, but the ugliest. So restaurants don't want the thorny oysters. You don't get them on the half shell. When I was 10 years old, I picked my first oyster. The 3 people that got the leases, unlikely they could have competed, at least 2 of them, could have competed in anything but the lottery. And as far as the learning curve, I'm putting my money on them, because when you 3rd generation oyster man, it's just like going to a new crop in farming. You might have to learn about the new crop, but you know the basics of farming. So you're way ahead of folk who are out there trying to learn it from scratch. And Sonny Timmons' boy, Jerome, who got one of those leases, you walk behind your daddy carrying a sack of oysters with fisherman boots on, coming out of a bog. If you can do that, you can do anything. But it's going to be good with the water flow that smooth the shells of the oysters and make them restaurant quality. That's the key. But to look at and sit down in some fine restaurants, I'm coming to your restaurant, never been, but we're coming. I sit down in a restaurant in Georgia, and all of the oysters are offered from out-of-state oysters. I'm sitting there from the coast of Georgia eating a Massachusetts oyster is sacrilegious. So I'm waiting a little while. But you guys have gone about it right. You've looked at how not to do it. And I predict that your numbers are going to be exceeded as far as the financing. The folk who had trouble, a lease is like a franchise. Now, you don't want to plant a new crop of cotton and walk into a Citibank on 5th Avenue, who ain't never had them close to the cotton in a pair of trousers. So when you walk into a lease on a coastal bank that understands potential, you can get the money. The money is available because all of a sudden you have something valuable, because when it starts rolling, that $75,000 is a pittance, because you now have a McDonald's franchise in a great location that is one hell of a sellable item. Thank you.
And just to make sure, that's not you're bringing 70,000 or 75 to the table. Is that you have the ability to when it's time to go to work.
That's all it is. The ability to get.
Chairman Watson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Doug, you mentioned that y'all weren't going to be enforcing the cage fees or whatever, and that was part of the legislation. What's the reason for not coming forward with any changes that we need to make to the legislation? Because that's kind of what we do. If there's an issue, then let us fix it. Chairman Corbett here handled some hemp legislation a couple of years ago, and we've seen it, I think, 2 or 3 more times since then, and we've been making it better and better every year. And I guess that's my question: is if there's some things that we need to do, why not go ahead and bring them forward where we can make those changes?
We can certainly do that, but our thought was, let's get cages in the water. Let's let these guys produce. Let's see where some of the other issues are, and bring them back to you as a comprehensive package, rather than piecemealing it. We've talked to DNR leadership and law enforcement, and everybody's okay with not enforcing that particular part of the law. And so let's get through this first year, see what else comes up. If you'd like to, I'm not going to say no, thank you, yet please, but I'd rather bring it as a comprehensive package in 2 years or so. Let's see what else needs to be done.
And I guess one more quick question. I guess part of what's happening in Florida is they didn't kind of go slow and take things like we're doing it, and the industry just disappeared, and now they're suing us for something that they did. And so I guess I appreciate us being slow and being careful, because I don't want this happening on the Georgia coast, because being a farmer, I'm suffering from some of those consequences that Florida's done to themselves.
Right. I certainly don't want to say that we've put the cart before the horse by no means, because any sort of publicity begets good publicity. But the pressure that's been applied to the industry, to the non-industry, to get started, has caused some growing pains that we haven't even gotten going yet. It's good that, Georgia oysters are the top of mind for everybody, and we want to get there, but I want to make sure we get there in the right way. And so I appreciate your patience in allowing us to do that as well.
Mr. Ron?
I mainly just want to give kudos to the coastal division. Whenever you've got something new like this, it's just like the farmers with the farm bills, and people move in next door to them, bitch and moan about encroaching in the smell and that kind of stuff. Well, voters were there first, and that created a real collision course, if no pun intended. But you had voters that had traditional anchorages that were in direct competition with these potential areas that were supposed. It was $1 million industry. Well, boating is $1 billion industry. My little boat's 500 gallons of fuel alone, and it typically runs 1,000 or more. A small boat. My point is the department took this thing head on. They had people from all over the world that came in to Little Brunswick, Georgia, to voice their opinions, and the department worked through it. So we've got both industries that are going to be able to work together, and both are going to survive. And I just want to give them a plug.
Mr. Arlene, please.
Just real quick, how long does it take to get your first harvest, and what is the quality?
So first harvest, we can say pretty good with from the time that oyster is spawned, which is typically in April, May, June of each year. You can have, at a good site, you can have an oyster that you can sell within 10 to 12 months. So it's a year. In the southeast is very fortunate, and Georgia has really good water quality. Our warmer waters, our oysters grow pretty much year round, where if you look to the northeast, it's a cooler water. It can take, in some areas, 2 to 3 years to get a marketable oyster. So we can have very fast growth, which is good. And that opens up benefits, but it also opens up some, problems of just making sure that you're keeping up with sorting your crop and keeping everything in the right order. But yeah, it's very good. We're in a very good area for growth.
And the quality of the oyster?
The quality, our oysters, as Brian mentioned, the McIntoshes sell very well at his place. And we've been fortunate enough being involved with Oyster South and other colleagues. We've actually sent some of Georgia oysters up to Massachusetts once. And a colleague of mine presented those with Southern oysters. And because of the saltiness in Georgia, they were actually preferred in the of the Southern oysters. When you're in Boston, the Mac Daddy of oyster area, the Northerners actually like the Georgia ones the best for Southern oyster because of that salt.
And if you wouldn't let me add, just because this is kind of how I pay for my kids' daycare, is, Georgia oysters do hold up. You can eat raw oysters from Georgia next to stuff from Washington, Massachusetts, anywhere in New England, and you're going to be excited about it. There's a lot, like I said, the industry is basically built in. As soon as these things are ready to sell, there's going to be people ready to stroke checks and serve them. So that's not an issue at all. Quality is entirely based in terms of presentation, and the final quality of that oyster really depends on husbandry. And that's why I think one of the things that's going to be tricky is for people to sort of figure out how to manage, 50 to 100,000 oysters in a series of cages, because you don't just deploy the oysters in the cage and then wait for them to finish. They've got to be split. They've got to be tumbled. You've got to change the size of the bags. There's a lot of work that goes into this process to make sure that at the end of the day, it is a quality oyster, and that's why that's another push for summer harvest, because oysters do tend to grow very fast in the summer, and if you've got a lease that's full of material that's growing quickly in warmer months, then you're kind of against the wall with a lot of season opens back up.
Mac.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Can you hear me? I'm not familiar with oysters. I go eat with Representative Williams a lot, and he introduced me to oysters. But you said that oysters grow naturally in a cluster. So when you start farming or you start using the seed, does this eliminate the natural growth of the clusters? Or are they still there? And what is being done with these?
No, it does not impact. So where the leases are being cited, they're not over natural leases. As far as the floating leases are not over natural reefs. And the reason why our native ones grow clustered is because when oysters spawn in the springtime of the year, in Georgia, the only good substrate for an oyster to really attach to and grow is another oyster. So in the natural environment, when all those oyster larvae are swimming around and they're ready to set and cement themselves in place, they search out those areas that have oysters existing. So what we do in the hatchery is we set that oyster on an individual piece of really small shell, and that's the only time that oyster attaches. So by putting it as a single into the aquaculture gear and with proper husbandry, keeping it clean, you can grow that up as a single oyster, and it does not impact the wild beds at all. So we're leaving that in place.
Thank you. Thank you, Doug. I just got one question. Kind of following up from what Brian has asked, I think 3 times about summer harvest. I mean, I think he's made a good, point that there's a need. Where are we at on
summer
that way? Yeah.
So it's certainly allowable through legislation that was passed. Once we have established growers who have proven track record, and we're thinking that's a year or 2 into the process, then we'll begin to move those folks who are interested in summer harvest into summer harvest. Okay. But because the regulations and the handling of that oyster is so much more critical during those hot water months, sure, we feel like they need to prove to us that they can handle the oyster during the regular months. So my thought would be once they're in production, we're probably 2 years in production for each individual before they can apply for it. Okay, just want to make sure. And just a real quick comment to Representative Taylor. Sorry. Ask your fellow Chairman Burns, because he had Ernest McIntosh oysters night before last. And he was confident. We had oysters 2 nights ago with several folks, and he enjoyed it very much. So.
Do you mind if I ask, shouldn't it be as simple as just applying some time and temperature regulations to the legislation? I mean, that's what every other state does.
And that's what the bottle shellfish ordinance does. It applies time and temperature. But we believe that it needs to be also experience involved in that. And
and again, Doug touched on a very important item when we started this process. When we started this process, everyone said, try not to reinvent the wheel, and we haven't with this issue. South Carolina, we're almost mirrored with South Carolina. South Carolina has a closed season permit just like ours, and they also have minimum requirements before you're permitted as a summer harvester. And so you got to go through the minor leagues before you hit the major leagues. And so I think everyone would agree that you don't want a grower that's starting to harvest his oysters with time temperature regimes for less than 2 hours from harvest to refrigeration, and then trying to figure out, how am I going to do that? How am I going to make that happen? So from an established grower, no problem. But if you've just started harvesting oysters, you've got to figure out all the fundamentals of how to safely get your product from the water to a cooling regime. And the difference of doing it right and doing it wrong, the stakes are tremendous. Two illnesses constitutes an outbreak. If I'm hit with an outbreak in my growing area, I have to shut down the outbreak and do an investigation. Those days that industry is closed, they lose money every day. So the goal is prevention. It's not let's wait till we get there. It's let's do everything we can to keep us from getting there. And then if it happens, it happens. But we've done everything that we can to educate and to prepare our growers
he carried this bill to the yeoman's work. He fought in committees like Reverend Al Williams said that, he fought tooth and nail. These guys with deep pockets, they want to come in and buy up all the leases to make sure that the average Georgian could be able to participate. We just want to thank Jess for that work.
Lastly, Ms. Bentley.
Curious to know about the workforce. I'm always hearing about a labor shortage across the state and other industries. Are you all experiencing that as well?
I can honestly say that I know one of our largest clamors is having workforce issues right now. And I would say, I would also venture that a lot of the people that have traditional intertitle leases are also having trouble attracting people to do the wild harvest that is very common. So it is something that our industry is seeing, and I wish I had the answer for it, but that's outside my area of expertise, but it is something that we have seen.
And a small step to combat that, McIntosh Academy, the high school in McIntosh County, along with the Coastal Pines Technical School, have developed a commercial fishing program. We're actually, through some federal grants, helping support that program. And it's because there's a labor shortage across all commercial fishing. It's hard work. And so anyway, they're trying to train kids who have that latitude to go towards commercial fishing. So that's a program that's just getting off the ground the last 2 years.
Nobody was looking for a job in the industry. You were born into it, and that's how you did. That's some of the hardest work in the world. You start harvesting oysters and shrimping, and that's tough work. Folks don't come out of school and say, they used to say, "Yeah, I'm gonna bid on my daddy's boat." Now they say, "I ain't never going back on the water no more."
Well, thank you. We appreciate the discussion. We need to keep moving here real quick, but thank you. We look forward to y'all guys putting together some recommendations so we can keep this thing moving. And we sure enjoy being part of it. We're going to take a break till 10. We've got some live stream issues. As Justin shakes his head, so we'll be back then. There are also pies up there in the